We're extremely lucky to have a very powerful panel representing the entire state of California around the conversation and question of the impact of COVID-19 on those people who are both in detention and, more broadly, trapped in our criminal justice system. Just by way of introduction, I'm Almas, and I'm going to be introducing our panelists. 5 days ago, a 57-year-old man named Escobar Mejia died at Otay Mesa in San Diego at the border. He was the brother of 2 sisters. He survived most immediately by 2 sisters and had a great deal of extended family in LA. Some of whom I actually live nearby in East LA. So this story has impacted me rather personally. Escobar asked for early release on April 15th after being detained in Otay Mesa in January and was denied that release. I think this moment has been incredibly sobering for so many of us who are now realizing that the pandemic is not only revealing a broken system generally, but a particularly egregious and horrifying immigration system. Now there are nearly 200 cases of people who have contracted COVID-19 at Otay Mesa alone, not even including other detention facilities across the state. To this end, we wanted to bring together a pretty esteemed panel to talk about what this means for our communities and some pathways forward. Organizers will always save us, and that's true here as well. We're joined by Jenny Pasquarella from the ACLU, the director of the Immigrant Rights Project, and a close partner of CIPC's in the work. All of the people joining us today are close partners in the work. Janaya Dunlap, the Deportation Defense Coordinator from the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice, our partners in the Inland Empire. Valeria Suarez, the Northern California Coordinator from the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance. Thanks for joining us, Valeria and Janaya. Lily Serrano from the Alianza Comentaria of San Diego, who also works with us very closely, and Dulce Garcia, the Executive Director of Border Angels in San Diego. We're really lucky to have all of you with us. I can see also that some of Assemblymember Banta's staff has joined us, so let me pause just in case we also have the Assembly member on the call. Well, I'm hopeful that at some point he'll join, so please forgive us if we have to interrupt the conversation a little bit to fold him in. Jenny, if it's okay, could we start with you? The broader landscape in California, what are we looking at? How does it impact folks in detention, and just what strategies, particularly legal strategies, are you all thinking through? Welcome to Immigrant Day 2020.
Thank you, Almas. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. I hope everyone is keeping well and safe in this crazy, trying moment. So by way of overview, I thought I'd give a little bit of context for what immigration detention looks like in California, and then jump into some of what we've been seeing and fighting. So as Alma said, it's just a seriously dire situation. I think we all know how callous ICE is as an agency, and how they go out of their way to treat people like animals and not like human beings. And there could be no better expression, I think, of that than what we're seeing here in the response to COVID-19, because they essentially have done absolutely nothing to actually protect people. And it's only been through the intervention of courts, really, that they've done anything. And even then, we've had serious shortfalls. So before I dive into that, I'll just make sure people are all on the same page about what detention looks like in California. So there are 5 immigration detention facilities in California, from Yuba County at the top of the state to Imperial County and Otay Mesa and San Diego County. until the pandemic, those facilities were housing about 4,000 people. The Adelanto facility close to LA is the largest. It's in fact one of the largest in the country. Due to, as many of you are familiar with, AB 32, which was set and super promising bill that many of us fought for across the state to end immigration detention, particularly to end private immigration detention. Because of a loophole ICE has exploited, we're now looking at 2 additional facilities, or an expansion of Adelanto and an additional facility in Kern County being added, which are slated to land us in a place where we could potentially have as many as 7,000 people detained in California. When this pandemic started, the facilities were basically at capacity, with Otay Mesa being already at overcapacity. And I think one thing that's really critical in understanding what's happening in immigration detention is that, like any carceral setting, these are some of the most dangerous places that anybody could be when faced with this respiratory illness, COVID-19, because there's no escaping it. One person gets it and it can easily be passed to everyone else in that facility. And that's particularly true when you're talking about immigration detention, because these facilities are designed in such a way that everything is communal. You can't be in a place where you're not surrounded by other people. You're eating in communal facilities, you're sleeping in communal facilities, and some of the facilities are barracks. They're dorms with over 100 people, where you're sleeping in bunks that are separated by maybe 3 feet, right? So the function of these facilities makes it almost impossible to socially distance, and that's particularly true where the facilities are at capacity, because you're surrounded by people, you can't have that 6 feet of distance at any point. And then another important fact about detention is that 4 out of the 5 facilities in California are run by private prison companies. And this is primarily one of the biggest reasons why AB 32 passed, right? To end private prisons in the state of California, and including those that operate immigration detention facilities. So as part of that, what we know is that these facilities are notorious for medical neglect. So even before the pandemic, there were vastly inadequate medical resources provided to detainees, high rates of suicide, high rates of preventable deaths. So then when you look at what's happened with COVID-19, what we're seeing is that ICE has basically said, we're not going to do what all these other law enforcement agencies across the country have done and act like a responsible law enforcement agency and first look at ways that we can reduce the number of people that we're bringing into custody, and second, look at ways that we can reduce our jail or prison populations, our detention populations, in order to facilitate more social distancing. Instead, they have said, and they said from the start of the pandemic, we'll only do it if a court tells us that we have to. And so that's what has led to all the litigation that you've seen across the country. And one thing that I think is super important for people to understand is that immigration detention only exists. It is so unlike criminal detention. And that's because you're not there because you committed a crime. You're not there as punishment. You're only there because ICE has said, we need to detain people in order to ensure that they can show up for their immigration court hearings. That is the purpose of immigration detention. But over time, as laws have evolved, first we inherited what's known as mandatory detention. So people under immigration law, some people are subject to mandatory detention even before their immigration hearings. So that means that people are often detained for very prolonged periods of time, even before they've ever had a judge look at their case. And sometimes the people can be detained for years, as we know. But then we also know that ICE has taken policies, adopted policies, to basically ensure that more and more people are subject to detention that don't need to be subject to detention. People who are eligible to be released on bail, eligible for parole under the immigration laws, and they do that deliberately because they want people to give up their immigration cases. And this is a form of basically denying people their dignity, denying people their rights, so that they will give up their immigration cases and leave. And it's one of the grossest, I think, example of some of the inhumane ways that our government is treating people. And so when you look at that and you look at this pandemic, people do not need to be in immigration detention in the first place. ICE can, if they wanted to, they could put people on supervised release. There's all these other alternatives to detention that they could use. in order to, facilitate what they say is necessary to ensure that people show up at their immigration hearings. But instead they said, no, force us to do it, force us to release people. And so that's led to litigation across the country, initially, and including in California, initially with individual habeas petitions being filed, so on behalf of individual detainees to get them released. And I think a lot of the litigation that started in California as well as across the country was focused on people who were medically vulnerable, who we knew, based on what they were saying because of COVID-19, would die if they got the virus. And that litigation just sort of spread like wildfire, and you had courts issuing just really just, I think, tremendously symbolic of what we all know about how inhumane immigration detention is, with courts saying things like ICE is acting barbaric, they're playing Russian roulette with people's lives, they are callous neglect for human beings. And so since some of the success with the individual habeas petitions, there's then been a move, including in California, to bring class actions to try to get more people out. So it's not just, you don't have to go to court one by one, but we're talking about this is urgent, and we need to get as many people out of these places as possible. And so we've had some good success. There's been a lot of frustrating setbacks, but just to give folks an idea, through just the ACLU litigation, I know there's been litigation from numerous other partners and from individual immigration lawyers. And Otay Mesa, which is now, folks probably know, experiencing the largest outbreak of COVID in the country. ICE is reporting, as of today on their website, 144 people tested positive. There's been 77 people released through the litigation in Otay Mesa and Imperial. About 70 people released from the Mesa Verde and Yuba facilities through our litigation. And in Adelanto, about 8, but that's just from the ACLU SoCal's litigation. We know that from what ICE has reported that more than 52 people have been released through litigation. So that's like individual habeas petitions and other lawsuits that folks have filed. One thing to note about Adelanto is that we obtained a really amazing order from the district court saying that ordering ICE to urgently depopulate the facility so as to facilitate social distancing. And unfortunately, that decision was stayed by the Ninth Circuit. And so it hasn't gone into effect, which is why we've had, I think that's been the biggest setback that we've had so far in getting people released from Adelanto. I think the other thing that I would note is that, and I think it's important that people recognize that while ICE has been reporting the numbers about people testing positive in Otay Mesa, that doesn't mean that people are not also positive with COVID-19 in the other 4 California facilities. We know that ICE basically hasn't been testing in those facilities. I think our last report through litigation in Adelanto was that they had tested all of 4 people, even though the detainees themselves are reporting that people all around them are sick with COVID-19 symptoms. And we've had reports from individuals saying that it's taken, I think one individual reported that it took a woman basically collapsing and becoming unconscious to actually who had COVID-19 symptoms to actually get medical attention. So that just shows, I mean, when we talk about medical neglect, we're talking actual neglect, like people are presenting symptoms of this deadly disease and nobody in the facility does anything. So what are some of the answers to this? Obviously there's the litigation trying to get people released, but I think it's really important that we also be mindful of what we can do as a state of California. We know that ICE is not listening and they don't care. And we know that Congress is somewhat constrained in what and how they can hold them accountable. But I think we have a really, really critical role to play in California in showing the country what we think humane response to this crisis means, particularly for people who are in immigration detention. And one of those things is to ensure that we don't continue to populate these deadly immigration detention centers. And why I think that is so important is that I think people often don't realize just how much we facilitate ICE making arrests of individual community members. In regular days, like pre-COVID, about 40% of all ICE arrests in California come from state prisons and local jails, 40%. So the rest come from federal prisons and come from ICE making arrests in the community. The rates are actually higher in other states, and that's because we have protections like SB 54 that we all fought hard to win. But right now in this pandemic, it's almost 100%. Almost 100% of all the ICE arrests that are happening that are facilitating the populating of these deadly facilities are from transfers from jails and prisons. So if California were to stop doing that, we could then have a real impact in ensuring that we're depopulating these facilities and not putting people into dangerous conditions. And so I know, we were very hopeful about legislative opportunities to end transfers in California, and it looks like the Vision Act may not be possible this year, but we still have a lot to do and a lot to say, and the governor of California can stop these transfers. We filed a lawsuit in the state Supreme Court urging the court to intervene to tell the governor that he can't continue to violate people's constitutional rights by facilitating transfers into California. But whether or not we win in that case, he should do it on his own, and we can all raise our voices and help to facilitate that. So I'll share in the chat box, if I can, our petition on that front. I know there's other actions that are happening. And then I just wanted to share, I don't know who has access to it, but I wanted to share an audio clip.
Yeah, Jenny, I think we're going to hold the audio towards the end and bring other speakers in if that's okay. But it's my plan to make sure that we show it like right as before the panel closes. I wanted to recognize and say and welcome Assemblymember Bonta. Thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your busy schedule. My former Assemblymember in East Bay and San Francisco, 18th District of California. You have about 100 people with you on the line, and then a few dozen more on various social media channels, just to give you some context. We have representatives from regions across the state who are going to give us a snapshot of what this looks like right now. But given Jenny's broad framing and thoughts about what's happening, it would be great, Assemblymember Bonta, given what's happened with the Vision Act and some of the bills that you've shown great leadership and investment and sponsorship in, what you think the state, what the possibilities are, both through the legislature, but probably more likely through the governor's office, to stem the increased risk of COVID-19 to those folks who are in detention.
Thanks. Good to see everybody. And for those on the line who can hear me, hello, Rob Bonta here in the California State Assembly. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you. I'm honored to be with you. And, this is to that question, this is a year like no other. The sort of traditional ways to accomplish outcomes for the people that we care about, to protect vulnerable communities, to provide voice to folks that are disadvantaged isn't necessarily the way to accomplish things this year. For the last 7 weeks, nearly everything has been done by executive order that was being done in response to COVID. It was being done with obviously a lot of leadership from the governor and his team, but with legislative partnership and input and shaping and doing a lot of things together. Telling the governor that some of the work that he has done, while good, didn't go far enough, and we pushed him to go further on some things. For example, tenant protections for evictions. He started off with something that was not strong enough and deferred to locals to act. Locals didn't act, and so legislators, including me and others, asked him to do more. So this is kind of on an ongoing continuum. There's iterations in what we do, and there are different pathways this year that are available that haven't been available in the past. So meaning legislation is not the only path, and not having the Vision Act be heard in a committee is not the end of our fight, of our push. It's a righteous issue. It's the right issue. We are protecting Californians, their health, safety, and welfare in dangerous detention centers. And through our efforts, as we just heard from the prior panelists, if we stop the direct transfer from county jails and state prisons, that could help reduce the population by 40%. That's what we still need to be doing, and we need to keep pushing for that issue, getting it to the governor, and pushing for executive order, preparing it for the possibility of a budget trailer, uplifting the issue when it comes up, which is every day. We're hearing more horrible data about real people's lives who are being destroyed inside immigration detention centers, and showing that it's not some speculation or some worry about the future, although all of us on this line could have predicted it based on what we know about precautions that weren't being taken, and that the congregate settings and the communal living that exists inside detention centers, it's happening. People are getting hurt. Our people, Californians, people that deserve better, that deserve safer, healthier conditions. So we need to keep uplifting it. I feel we're going to get something done. I'm hopeful and confident. Certainly, there's a very powerful argument about folks who are in the COVID-19 vulnerable population being direct transferred into facilities, immigration detention centers, given it could be a death sentence. And certainly no one should be exposed to these conditions where we know that they're not taking steps. So I'm hopeful something can be done. And so the legislature is moving like 20% of the bills that were originally introduced. We're dealing with a budget that has projections of $54 billion in shortfall as of last week. It could get worse than that as the recession unfortunately deepens, and as the lag of information comes in, so we really know what our state is. But there's more and more appropriate attention to locked facilities and detention centers, whether it be state prison or county jails, and certainly immigration detention centers. So I think we just need to keep our push, immediately pivot as we are away from a bill towards other paths, towards the sign-on letter that you're so appropriately working on, to seek an executive order, hopefully turn that into an executive order on some universe of the folks who need help, all if possible, some if we have to, and then try to turn it into a budget trailer bill for more permanent support. So there's one pathway goes away, another pathway opens up and emerges, and we just need to be ready to be able to pivot and continue our fight in the place where we're most likely to get the outcome that we are seeking.
Thanks so much, Assemblymember Banta. To echo this point, everyone who was in a legislative meeting today shared the letter that Jenny referenced in her comments to get a signature from the legislative member that folks were meeting with. And then Jenny has noted a petition that all of us could sign to make this happen. I want to bring in powerful organizers in their regions, I think, who could only elevate and buoy Assemblymember Banta and Jenny's points that if the legislature is not an avenue for addressing this right now, then there are other ways. Janaya Dunlap from ICIJ, hi. I wanted to just get a sense of what is going on in Riverside from the organizing perspective, how that work is happening, and what are campaigns and work that people should know about.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So here in the Inland Empire, we're kind of contending with two different issues, right, when it comes to immigration enforcement during COVID, right? One of those obviously relates to the Adelanto Detention Center, being that it's located in our backyard, right? And a lot of folks that are detained there often end up being in the Inland Empire residents. And I think one of the most concerning aspects of this is the fact that the San Bernardino Sheriff announced that they are voluntarily going to be responding to subpoenas by ICE in order to get information on folks. And that is something that they are not only not required to do, but actually may be violating California law by doing, right? And they're doing this voluntarily because all along they have been looking for new ways to work with ICE, right? And this is deeply concerning because as a lot of arrests aren't happening in the community due to some of the bad publicity that ICE got back in a couple weeks back when they said that they would be continuing ICE operations. A lot of the arrests that we're seeing out here come from, as Jenny referenced earlier, folks, being transferred from jails into immigration custody. And then the other issue that we're also seeing is that we have significant Border Patrol presence in the region. And so we are seeing an increase in activity by Border Patrol, especially in southwestern Riverside County, even instead of a decrease as you would expect. And so a lot of times what we're seeing is one, they're keeping the checkpoint on the I-15 coming up towards Temecula 24/7 in operation. But not only that, but they're increasing community patrols where they'll stop people randomly on major highways throughout the region and start questioning them about their status. And so we're talking about specifically seeing Border Patrol stopping essential workers, such as landscapers such as grocery workers, construction workers, folks that have to continue working because they're essential for the state of California, being harassed and taken into custody by Border Patrol. And I'll give you a recent example of what that looked like, right? We had this father of 3 kids, husband to a US citizen, who was picked up at the checkpoint on his way home to Lake Elsinore from the San Diego area.
And we have a note from our interpreter. If you could just elongate and slow down a little bit, so that way we can capture everything you're sharing.
Great, okay. So yeah, so in this case, this gentleman was stopped at the I-15 checkpoint on his way home from San Diego County, and he was picked up by Border Patrol even though he had his immigration case closed out in court, administratively closed, meaning that they would have no jurisdiction to place him back in removal proceedings. He was taken into Border Patrol custody, and then they, under cover of night, at about 2 or 3 in the morning, took him down to the border and dropped him into Tijuana. Now, another aspect of this story is that he is from Guatemala and not from Mexico. And so they took a Guatemalan citizen to the wrong country under cover of night, violating his constitutional and due process rights. And it took significant work by some of our orgs within the coalition, the ICJ, for us to get him brought back to the US. And so this is kind of a part of a consistent pattern that we're seeing out here, where instead of kind of like stepping back during COVID, they're actually increasing their presence in the area.
Thanks, Janaya. Hopefully we're going to have more time to talk about other follow-up, but I wanted to just make sure that you were able to share the organizing strategy or the campaign that ICIJ has been engaging in to get people involved in the work in Riverside, or just to make sure that community has the information that they need.
Yeah, so we have 2 key campaigns that we're doing around this. One is obviously around the Adelanto Detention Center, trying to get folks out by using multiple strategies, including obviously participating in the legal strategy, helping with individual requests for parole, and getting community members involved in document gathering and some of the process of trying to get folks released on parole, as well as one of our other projects, which is bringing together Southern California legal service providers to increase capacity for bond and other release measures. And then when it comes to the Border Patrol issue, it's mostly just been a matter of trying to get the word out to communities in that area as to what their rights are, specifically because the communities that are being targeted by Border Patrol are folks that usually have little access to information and little access to resources around these kinds of issues. And so it's extremely essential for us as a community be constantly uplifting what's happening and reaching out to make sure that folks are aware of what they can do in case of being stopped by a Border Patrol agent.
Thanks, Janaya. I'm hopeful that we'll have a chance to talk more. I want to move the conversation to our partners in San Diego. We have Dulce and Lily with us, who are both monitoring what's happening at Otay Mesa, but also monitoring what's happening around the securitization of the border. Lily and Dulce, I don't know who's going to speak to which issue, but could you both provide an overview of what's happening in these in both places, border and Otay Mesa, and then organizing strategies that you think are important for us to know about?
Yes, Almas, thank you for that. Just kind of following on what Yanaya was mentioning, for those of us who do work, specifically immigrant rights work in the border region, it's very, very important to remember that we have always been dealing with different layers of immigration enforcement, right? We definitely have ICE, and it's a deportation machine that is creating a lot of harm in our community. And Dulce will speak more on what's going on in Otay Mesa. But also for those of us who are on the streets, right, monitoring what our community members are facing, the presence and the increase of activity by Border Patrol has been a big concern. I was just going to echo everything that Janaya mentioned about the established checkpoints on the 15 and 5 freeways that have traditionally been, we have seen a decrease over the years of their usage. Now they're operational every day. Just to add to that, we, at least on the San Diego side of the border, southern border, we have seen a lot of mobile checkpoints being set up in routes that are not traditional. So for example, as we speak right now, there is a checkpoint, a Border Patrol checkpoint on the Highway 76, which is along the most rural areas in San Diego County. It's actually in its way out of the county into the Inland Empire. And these highways are mainly transit by farm workers. Really what's out there in those communities is the Pala community. All you will see is farms and casinos. And right now all the casinos are shut down. So there is definitely an intentional use of this pandemic as an excuse to scale up their enforcement activity. We have also seen a lot of Border Patrol presence in our beaches. So this is not, this is very intentional. This is a psychological welfare against our communities. They don't just want to come and take and kidnap our community members and then put them in this horrible detention facilities that all my colleagues are talking about, but they want us to know about it, right? They want us to remind us that they're constantly watching. And there, I mean, I could share with all of you, but it's just really a quick Google search of Border Patrol presence in state beaches, and you can see that they are even posing for cameras. We have also seen definitely an increase on the border, Border Patrol now denying people's international rights to seek asylum by just sending them back to our southern border to Mexico, whether they're Mexicans or not, or whether they qualify for or have a case to seek asylum in this country. I will actually ask Dulce to elaborate on what we're seeing in terms of detention.
Yes, thanks, Lady. Well, we saw last month how ICE and through Civic Corps laid out a death trap inside of the Otay Detention Center. Carlos Ernesto Escobar Mejia's death certainly could have been prevented, because when they started to create what they considered cohorts inside of the Otay Mesa Detention Center, Carlos had not yet been infected. What we mean by cohorts is that I started to create inside of the detention center units of 100 plus people. And even though families had already posted bond and other organizations like Border Angels and SDRC had posted bond, they were not letting us release folks out of the Otay Mesa Detention Center, and they had to be in that detention center for 14 days. And it's, as it was meant for, impossible to distance folks inside of a unit where they're sleeping up to 8 people in a cell, where the duty to preserve everything clean is up to the detainees. They were not provided masks or gloves or even antibacterial gel, because antibacterial gel contains alcohol, which is the ingredient that kills the virus, yet they weren't trusted with it. So all of this created the circumstances for folks to become not only infected, but now we see a death from there. As it was mentioned, now there's over 200 people infected at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. That includes detainees and staff members, and also people in custody from the marshals, U.S. Marshals. Now we're able to bond people. They're no longer doing this cohort. We're able to place bonds for folks, but one of the biggest challenges is given COVID-19, fundraising for the 2 bonds that are here locally in San Diego. And so that has been a very important strategy to getting folks out of the detention center, because ICE constantly keeps putting hurdles in front of us to get folks out, whether it's providing an identification document for someone that went through 7 or 11 countries to get to America, as is the case of one man from Ethiopia that we can't provide an original passport for, and therefore he's being held for ransom there for $5,000. We keep getting reports every single day still today for lack of medical care and PPE. There's been also reports of inadequate food. Obviously, it's not nutritious what they've been provided in there. Reports of food being delayed for hours. As an example, breakfast would be served at 6 in the morning and then lunch at 4 p.m. And only folks that have money in their commissaries are able to then eat during those long hours. To earn a single dollar inside of the detention center means that you work all day to get $1. And a lot of people choose to use that money to place phone calls to secure legal representation or talk to organizations like ours or talk to even family members. So again, only those people that are able to have money in their commissaries are able to purchase food and some of the hygiene products that they need inside. Even when people complain about muscle pains, headaches, or other complaints that have been seen as potential COVID-19 indicators, they are still not provided a test unless they consistently show a high fever. As a result of that, people inside of the detention centers have started hunger strikes inside of the detention center, and folks have been in these hunger strikes for weeks now, but we have seen reports of retaliation, including access to phone and food as a result of this. One of the incidences where someone refused to be coerced by signing onto the waiver to get a mask in English resulted in tear gassing. So these all incidences that have occurred here at the Old Time Detention Center. When we heard as a community that they were lacking masks inside of Otai, as a community we came together to provide over 800 masks to folks inside of the detention center, and this was done in collaboration with the Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher, who was essentially dismissed by the facility and ICE and told to leave the masks behind, but they were never used. We continue to receive calls every single day from folks that are in there afraid of dying because they have not been given parole documents, and they have been in detention for months without the ability to know how much they need to pay in order for them to be released. And even when we do know how much needs to be paid, ICE keeps providing obstacles, like you have to go in person to post a bond. You can't do it electronically, you can't pay by phone, you have to go in person, which means that community members from across the state have driven hours and hours to come here in the hopes of being able to bond their family member, and they have to wait here hours until ICE processes the paperwork, and even then their family member might not be released until the following day or the day after. Again, exposing all of the folks in our community and anyone that has something to do with the bond process for potentially acquiring COVID-19, which makes this a local issue. For us to, whenever we bond someone out, it's not just seen in isolation. So we don't see this just as an issue about folks inside of the detention center. This impacts every single one of us, because when we are successfully able to release someone from the detention center, they are in our community. So those people are part of our communities, and therefore all of us should be caring about what happens to those folks inside of the detention center. Thank you.
Thanks, Dulce. That's so incredibly helpful context setting about conditions in centers. Before we move to Valeria from CEJA, I know that there's lots of questions in the chat box. I'm going to try and get to a few of them at the end of the conversation, but I do want to bring Valeria in because Dulce in particular, but also Inaya highlighted the importance of bail bonds. And the work that's been happening in Northern California, I think, really sets the standard in some ways, pre-COVID and currently. Valeria, could I bring you in just to talk about that piece that you all are holding? And thank you for your work.
Yes, thank you. Given that CEJA is a statewide organization, we have folks working with Mesa Verde and also folks working with Adelanto. So I think that's something that has made it really successful in freeing folks. It's the bond, specifically in the Bay Area. I will actually link them here, but we have two different funds. We have the Bay Area Immigrant Bond, which is we're focusing on fundraising in order to free folks from detention centers, specifically from Mesa Verde Detention Center. And then we also have the fund, which is the commissary fund. And that is in order to provide folks with like shampoo, soap, antibacterial soap, which is very needed in detention centers. And folks are like not having access to this, given that they need money in their commissary fund in order to be able to access that. So we have those two funds going. I would say that like very quickly in terms of Mesa Verde, I would, like the reason why we had a really huge victory in freeing all the women from Mesa Verde Detention Center this past Friday, right on time for Mother's Day, is given to two very specific things in terms of the leadership. One is that we made sure to follow the leadership of directly impacted people inside detention. It was them who organized and who completely created the strategy for the hunger strike. And it was the leadership of youth. It was Kern youth abolitionists, youth who are based in the area of Kern County where Mesa Verde is located. Both of their leadership from folks inside and outside is what freed folks. And in terms of the Bay Area role, we were really just like fundraising and as playing a supportive role, what folks inside and outside the detention center were the ones really taking a lead in both strategy, organizing, and messaging. The reason why our campaigns were successful, similar to things happening in San Diego and Adelanto, is that really right now, in terms of COVID, detention right now equals death. And we really made sure to push that messaging that folks need to be freed. No one should be inside a cage, but even more in times of now, something that was helpful for this campaign was to really uplift the voices of folks inside Mesa Verde Detention Center. Many of them wrote letters that we were just read and uplifted, and it was their voices that really helped free other folks. Right now, the fight continues, given that there's still like all the men most of them are still left inside Mesa Verde. So we're hoping that both pushing the immigrant bond fund and the commissary fund will help support them and free them eventually.
Valeria, thank you so much. And thanks for the links that you've dropped in the chat box so people can support both the commissary fund as well as the bail bond fund. And thanks for that correction that the bond fund is statewide. I want to try and get some questions in before we close out. Forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit selective because we have a lot. But Jenny, I believe 2 questions might be for you and one you've answered, but just for people who are not reading the chat. What is the loophole that allows private detention facilities to operate in California? That's from Cynthia Anderson, who some of us know. And then are there still people in detention centers who were never transferred from jail or prison who could be released whether or not the governor stops new transfers? And if so, how much could we reduce the population in detention by releasing those people?
Yeah, so on the latter one, what we're asking for in the litigation is that the populations be reduced really significantly, basically up until the point that social distancing could be possible. Given the way that the facilities are designed, that would require a very significant reduction. I don't have the actual numbers because I think it depends on each facility, but most people would have to be released from the facility for that to be possible. Whether we'll get there, I think, remains to be seen from the response from courts. But that's what we're asking for. Definitely, there are a lot of people that are detained that are not there because of transfers. And so it's important that we both do everything that we can to get people out of the facilities and demand that ICE do that. But it's also important that we look at what, as I said, what our responsibility in California is, and the fact that California has a role in adding people to those facilities. So it makes little sense that courts can be ordering people released in order to facilitate social distancing and to protect people, and then to have those same facilities just repopulated every day by new transfers from state prisons or jails. And then on the first question, that has to do with AB 32, the bill that banned private prisons. And I feel like I should defer to Assemblymember Bonta on that, on the reason why ICE has exploited this loophole. Do you want to answer that, Assemblymember?
Yeah, sorry, just going to unmute there. Thanks for the opportunity, appreciate it. And thanks for the question. Like all bills, traditionally they take effect the January of the following year after they're passed and signed. So our bill went into effect on January 1st, 2020. And it specifically banned any expansions of existing contracts or any new contracts or extensions of existing contracts. But for contracts that were already in place, already signed and set to expire, those could be would be able to continue through their expiration date. The reason for that is because there was an argument that it would violate what's called the contract clause. It would violate an existing contractual obligation. And so two things happened. One, and for immigration, on the immigration detention side, the existing contracts that were in place were going to end soon in early January 2020. And I think maybe the last one was January 2021. So those were going to be were set to be ended by AB 32. But the federal government did something just incredibly unprecedented after the bill was signed in, I think it was October of last year, and before it went into effect on January 1st, 2020. It did an expedited request for proposal to provide expanded immigration detention center services by private corporations in California. And it basically designed it so that the existing providers would be able to provide those services in California and expand them. And they were multi-billion-dollar contracts awarded for up to 15 years. And generally, federal procurement keeps you on a much shorter leash, doing contracts 1 year at a time, expanding them after a year if the service is delivered and the cost is right. But they got very nervous about AB 32 and attempted an end run. We believe they violated federal procurement law in doing so, but that was their way to try to get around it by expanding immigration detention center contracts in California before the bill took place. So that was very unfortunate. And they've also sued the California, both the federal government and one of the providers, Geo Group, have sued Governor Newsom and AG Becerra in the state of California, arguing that these bills that seek to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our people somehow violate the supremacy clause or federal preemption and other components of the law that govern the relationship between the federal government and states. So that's how we got to where we are today, with this really just unprecedented, clear attempt to work around the bill and undermine what it does to protect people.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Bonta. A lot here between thinking about ending ICE transfers, how to properly implement AB 32. It's a longer conversation, and my hope is that it's the first of many to sort of ensure that we have all the information that we need to really think about what it means to be in detention despite the current pandemic. There are additional questions in the Q&A, but I am going to begin to close this out. There is an important announcement in the chat box that Movement for Human Integrity, a close partner in our work, all of our work, in Oakland tomorrow on May 12th, faith leaders and the family members of those detained will hold a public memorial service honoring the 17 who needlessly died inside California jails and prisons. It will be on Facebook, and then the particular link is in the chat box. Just as some next steps for this conversation to end on a powerful note before we move to closing out Immigrant Day of Action today, there is a petition that we are going to encourage and send to everyone to encourage their sign-on that asks California to end ICE transfers. In addition, there is a very extensive letter that several of us worked on last week to help get asking legislative members to sign on, again, asking the governor to end ICE transfers. And if you have additional things that you'd like to share, the bail bond fund and the commissary fund links are also in the chat box. If there are additional things, we're going to do our best to share all of those out, including Danny, I made this commitment around the audio piece. I think we're going to share it over social media, but it's a very powerful piece. Listening to someone in detention, sharing the current circumstances. Thank you to the ACLU for capturing that. 1,000 participants today, 100 visits. I'm about to hand it over to, I believe, Carmen Chang or Cynthia Riza to go into more detail of all of that. Thank you so much for joining us for like 4 hours of conversation about things that impact immigrant communities. It has been a powerful day. Appreciate all of you.